All right, in our last segment, we finished with the 3 different types of consumer involvement. Now we're moving into the meat and potatoes of this lecture. So now we're ready for the 5-step model of cognitive decision-making in consumer psychology, a 5-step model. In this segment, we're going to focus on step 1. And as you see here, this is problem recognition. So step 1 is problem recognition. It begins when a consumer acknowledges a discrepancy between what they want and what they've got. In other words, acknowledging a want-got app. In order for problem recognition to occur and us to get this want-got gap, the discrepancy must, and there's 2 qualifiers here. First, it must be a significant gap between the two, not a trivial one. So for instance, you're not just a little hungry, you're really hungry, right? You recognize it, you acknowledge it. It's not just something playing around in the background that is trivial. And 2, the discrepancy must relate to a solution that is attainable. That's easy to remember. Same thing was true, right, with the fear appeals when we looked at them in psychology. So let's just say, for example, let's say that you have a 2000 Ford Focus and you want a Lexus. But a Lexus may not be realistically in your budget, right? But if you envision a more realistic trade-up, maybe to a 2010 Toyota Camry, problem recognition is more likely to happen. So this does not apply to dreams and fantasies. This applies to something you perceive as really possibly happening. Okay? Want-got gap. So how are gaps created? Well, there are 2 ways they can be created, through needs and wants. And it's important here to understand the difference between the 2. So needs come through a decrease in your actual state. So you get hungry, a change in your actual state. Or you have your first child and realize you do not have adequate life insurance, a change in your actual state. Needs are harder for marketers to create. When they do, it's usually through increasing your insecurity, like trying to convince women that they need a special deodorant for their private parts when good hygiene is the only real determinant, or trying to convince men that they need more hair when success in life is not related to hair in males. Okay? On the other hand, wants come from an increase in your desired state. Right here, an increase in your desired state. Well, your actual state actually remains the same. So you want the newest music. You want to eat out instead of in. But your actual state hasn't changed, right? And this is important. Why is this so important to know? Because marketing tends to target wants most, because they are the easiest to create and to manipulate, rather than trying to convince you that your actual state has decreased. So if your actual state remains the same, where do wants come from? Well, the goal of advertising is to create wants. Food ads at nighttime often prime you for snacking, even if you're not hungry. Okay? After enough snacking from the TV, it can become habitual, right? So we're constantly bombarded by ads on TV, the internet, billboards, store windows, magazines. We're surrounded by them and they create wants. But that's not the only way. Advertisers don't always come to us to create wants. We at times create our own wants by intentionally browsing. So we may browse online. We may look for the coolest new gadget website, or we may go in stores like Best Buy just to see what new stuff is out there, right? Or we might go to our favorite fashion company on the internet and browse new fashions. Okay. And then finally, we have social comparison. This is a powerful one. And there's another name here that I want you to be familiar with. Remember that on every test, we're going to have a researcher Jeopardy types of questions, a whole category of them. And you're only responsible for the last name, but this is a really important researcher. Leon Festinger has published, he published his social comparison theory way back in 1954, and it has produced a lot of research since then. So comparing ourselves to others, that we're surrounded with in our social environment can create these wants. For instance, research shows that when a neighbor gets a new and better car, the odds that their neighbors will buy a new one increases significantly. Social comparison. Okay. Step 2 in our model is of cognitive decision making is information search. So after the problem is acknowledged, people tend to go on an information search. Okay. This involves considering things like the costs involved. And you might think of costs involved as being the price sticker, but it's more than that, right? You have to invest more to get that product. There's going to be, for instance, if you go to a mall, gas and driving there, parking, dealing with a crowd, right? I particularly do not enjoy that. Internet shopping may eliminate some of these, but it still takes up valuable time. So another factor, that can, one of the factors is cost, and time savers can be helpful there. But another factor that can affect our information search is brand overload. Okay? Brand overload can be really overwhelming and kind of shut us down, right? Especially in the United States, where we are often faced with too many choices. Okay? And now we come to our next really important researcher, Miller. George Miller was a really famous cognitive psychologist, and most of his work came out way back in the 50s. And he came up with what is now called Miller's Rule, named after him. He explored the average number of things that people are comfortable considering at one time. And he found that what we call working memory, what you can work with at one time, is limited to, usually between 5 and 9 items. So the average or magic number here is a number 7. Miller's Rule, the magic number 7. So we can consider about 7 things at one time, give or take 2. The average, or the magic average here being 7. In fact, brand overload, can prompt habitual buying. How often have you just looked at an aisle like this and just grabbed your trusted brand instead of seriously studying and considering the many brands that they have? Step 2, other factors that can include the information search. Some of them are individual factors. Okay, so young people who are educated and middle income and have a moderate product knowledge, level of product knowledge, tend to perform the most information search. Again, that's young, educated, middle income, and only moderate product knowledge. Really? Just moderate knowledge is related to more information searching? Yes, and I'll tell you why. If you look at the other ends, okay, people with really low knowledge don't really understand the search results as much, and so they tend to stop sooner. And those with high knowledge tend to rely more on memory, in other words, old information, right, than engaging in searches for new information. And then finally, perceived risk can affect information search. The more risk of buying the wrong item, for example, the more information that we tend to search out, that we, engage in that time in information search. Remember the perceived risks from earlier in this lecture? I'm going to challenge you right now to hit the pause button on your video and see how many, the names of them, that you can remember. Then turn it back on, I'll give you the answers. Okay? So there were 5 different kinds of perceived risk that we looked at: monetary risk, functional risk, physical risk, psychological risk, and social risk. Okay. All right, so we've covered steps 1 and step 2. With our next segment, we are going to cover step 3 in the cognitive decision-making process.